Let's talk a little bit about how we can combine application security groups, or ASGs, with NSG rules and private endpoints. So in my topology here, I've got everything inside of Azure EastUS, single virtual network. I've got a subnet called main, which has got my virtual machine inside of it. And I've got a subnet called PE that's got a single private endpoint inside of it. See the IP addresses on the screen here. This private endpoint is connected to a Azure storage account, and this storage account has got all public access disabled and only this single private endpoint enabled. I've carried out the associated DNS integration, so I've got an Azure DNS private zone. So from this virtual machine, when I try and connect to my storage account, it does return the 2.36 address, not the public address. If I look at my virtual machine networking information, I can see that on the Application Security Groups tab, I've got it tagged as ASG-frontend, which is representing my front end of my application, which is this virtual machine NIC here with the IP address 172.16.2.4. This video is not supposed to be a detailed talk about the value proposition of ASGs, but imagine if I had a collection of virtual machines that represented my front end and I didn't want to track all of the IP addresses. I could just instantiate the tagging of those NICs with ASGs in code, and my logic with NSGs becomes very simple. So the NIC here is ASG-frontend. Our private endpoints also support ASGs. So here's my private endpoint, which has got this address 2.36. When I built this private endpoint, I tagged it with ASG-backend. That's represented by the orange X there in the diagram. The first test will show how we can combine these features together is with an outbound NSG on my virtual machine subnet. So here I've got an NSG which is applied to this subnet. And in the outbound rules section, I've configured a couple of rules. I've got one rule that's priority 200, which is denying all traffic destined to this range here. I've got another rule which has got a higher priority, which is controlling traffic from my ASGs. If I look inside of this rule here, you see source, ASG front end, destination, ASG back end. At the moment, I've got that set to deny. So both of these rules are set to deny. Therefore, the aggregate behavior at the moment is that if this virtual machine here tries to contact my storage account, it will get blocked because it will try and contact the NIC outbound and be denied by this rule here. So let's see what that looks like now and confirm that's the case. So first of all, you can see when I ping my storage account FQDN, I do get back the private endpoint IP. If I now configure a AZ copy to try and copy a text file from my local machine here to my container on my blob account, we can see that it's stuck in the pending state. If you drill into the logs here for AZ copy, you'll see that it can't establish a network connection. If I then go one step further, and on this NSG here, I have enabled NSG flow logs. So when I parse my NSG flow log and find this particular flow, I can see there's my rule name, and here's my source, 2.4, my VM, going to 2.36. And I know that when I look into the tuple information, you can see the documentation on flow logs to understand what these mean. But I can see, for example, source port, destination port, TCP, outbound, and this D here means that the flow is being denied. So my expectation in my config is that the ASG-based NSG is denying the traffic, and that is working. If I go back to my NSG now, and let's change this first rule to be an allow rule. So now when traffic leaves this virtual machine and gets subjected to the NSG outbound logic, this priority 100 rule, which is allowing front end to back end, so this NIC to this NIC, this will be the rule which is hit first, and my traffic should now be allowed. Go back on my VM, exactly the same command, and we can see that transfer completed successfully. And if I look inside of my container on my blob account, I can see the text file has been inserted there. So there's an example of how we can use ASGs on the virtual machine source subnet outbound and benefit from NSG flow logs when talking to private endpoints, which can also leverage that ASG tagging behavior, which makes the rule instantiation much more simple. Okay, the second scenario how we can use this feature is moving the location of where we instantiate the NSG logic. So before I had the NSG configured outbound on my virtual machine subnet, now I'm going to configure the NSG inbound on my private endpoint subnet. You notice I've got network policy set to enabled as part of the requirements to use NSGs on private endpoint NICs. I'll leave a link below to the documentation in that area. And I've tweaked my NSG slightly. So I'm going to have my first rule still relevant for ASG front end to ASG back end tag. But my second rule, which denies the traffic, is going to deny all traffic from this 172.16.2.0/27 virtual machine subnet to anywhere. So effectively block all traffic into the private endpoint from that subnet. So what we would expect when I look at my inbound rules here, which I've configured, I've got them both set to deny at the moment just to prove they are effective. So I'll set these both to deny, and our virtual machine should not be able to connect. Indeed, we see that pending, and again, it's the network level reachability that's causing that AZ copy to finish. So just to confirm that the NSG is the thing that's moving the needle here, let's go back to our network security group. Inside of my inbound rule section, let's change that ASG rule here to allow. So again, front end, which is my VM, back end, which is my PE, allow that traffic. That rule is being instantiated now. Go back to our VM, try the copy again, and we'll see that completed straight away. So just to replay that one back, my virtual machine here tries to connect to storage, goes out to Azure DNS private zones, gets back the destination IP of 2.36, puts a packet on the network destined for that range. The virtual machine is allowed to communicate outbound, comes into my private endpoint NIC and is subject to this NSG. Because I've got a high priority rule, which is based on ASGs, allowing traffic from front end to back end, that traffic is allowed in despite me having a lower priority rule denying all traffic. There's an example of how we can leverage the new feature for NSG support inbound on private endpoints. And you can imagine that being a more scalable way of handling this, right? Because if you've got hundreds of source subnets, generally you configure NSG logic inbound close to the destination to make it manageable. But one thing to call out with this design decision to use the NSGs inbound here, despite them having the ASG support, as we've shown in this video, when you configure them inbound attached to a private endpoint, you lose the ability to collect flow logs. So despite me having flow logs turned on for this NSG, when I dive into those flow logs, I don't see the logs for traffic coming into those private endpoint NICs, because today, private endpoint NICs, when they have NSGs associated, don't support flow logging. And that's called out in our documentation, but that's on the roadmap coming in the future. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful. The takeaway here is that you can indeed combine ASGs with private endpoint NICs with NSGs to control your network security within a virtual network. Thanks for watching.